We're extending the warmest welcome to the first ASLE Spotlight in this series on the topic of decolonizing environments. I'm Lisa Fink, Assistant Professor in Lyman Briggs College and the Department of English at Michigan State University, located on Anishinaabe lands. I'm a settler scholar, and I teach and research at the intersection of feminist science studies, political ecology, environmental humanities, and critical Indigenous race and ethnic studies. For those of you joining an ASLE event for the first time, a special welcome. We're so glad that you've joined us today and invite you to help sustain and further our work by becoming an ASLE member if you're not already part of the association. ASLE acknowledges its office is located within Indakina, the ancestral and unceded homeland of the Abenaki people along the Quenetuka and Ashwelot watersheds in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. We recognize that this land has been cared for by the Abenaki for at least 12,600 years, including by the Sikoki, Pennacook, and other Wabanaki peoples. ASLE offers this statement as a way of affirming its commitment to recognizing and supporting Native history and culture in the Monadnock region and all regions where our members and officers dwell, past, present, and future. I'm delighted to be co-hosting this event with Dr. Sarah D. Wald.
Thank you. As Lisa just said, I'm Sarah D. Wald. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and English at the University of Oregon, which is located on Kalapuya-Illegee. My teaching and research sit at the intersection of the environmental humanities, environmental justice, and Indigenous race and ethnic studies, particularly in the context of Latinx and Asian American studies. ASLE's leadership launched this series in 2021 to elevate the work of our members in creative writing, scholarship, public engagement, and more. We are excited to continue fostering connections with new audiences through these spotlights. By way of logistical information, we will ask that you remain on mute, and we will have time for questions later. We're asking you to use the chat to pose these questions, and please try to keep your questions concise. We only have limited time together.
A brief note before we get started. We want to recognize the Day of Action that's currently happening in Minnesota to encourage everyone joining us to engage in their own solidarity actions. And we're going to be sharing a fundraising link in the chat. We especially recommend Monarca, which is an organization that's been responsible for training thousands of Minnesotans as ICE observers and in providing mutual aid. And on that website that Sarah Wald has just shared, they're listed under organizations doing work on the ground. Their rapid response classes have been helping neighbors protect neighbors. We also recommend neighborhood-specific fundraisers like Bryant Neighborhood Families in Need, and we'll also share that link to their GoFundMe in the chat.
So with that, we're ready to move to our first presenter. Our first presenter is David J. Vazquez, Professor of Critical Race, Gender, and Cultural Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for putting this together. So Sarah, Lisa, Amy, and Aubrey especially, but also my colleagues who are here today to share their wonderful books and to be in conversation. And I just want to also note that I'm coming to you from AU, which is located in Washington, D.C. on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Anacostia peoples. And this is my book. You can see it on the screen, Decolonial Environmentalisms. So I thought I would use my 5 minutes to give you something of an origin story for the book. So the genesis of this project was a conversation that we opened in Latinx Environmentalisms, Place, Justice, and the Decolonial, which I edited with Sarah Wald and Priscilla Solis Ibarra and Sarah Jaquette Ray. Latinx Environmentalisms was a project that was trying to outline parameters for the field. We hope to demonstrate, and I think we did, that the kinds of environmental thinking that we see in Latinx cultures are often simultaneously anti-racist and anti-capitalist. And I should note that I think of myself as a Latinx studies scholar who does environmental work rather than an environmental studies scholar who is engaging in Latinx studies. So I think we were right about our intervention, and the field seems to have really embraced these ideas, both within the environmental humanities and Latinx studies. And with another hat, I'm the president of the Latinx Studies Association. And one of the things I noted in this year's conference is that we have a significant portion of the proposals that were submitted have something to do with environmental ideas. So a conversation that we opened in Latinx environmentalisms around decoloniality, settler colonialism, and the fact that Latinx people are both settlers and inheritors of forms of indigeneity throughout the Americas never really felt satisfactory to me and I think also my co-editors. So some of this, excuse me, owed to the fact that we were grappling with ideas that were still nascent within settler colonial studies. We were really writing this book in like 2015, 2016. So these were nascent conversations at those times, particularly the role of what scholar Jessica Hernandez calls welcomed versus unwelcomed guests on indigenous lands. Another issue that we tried to address but didn't quite have the language or theoretical apparatus to answer was the tension between decolonial Latin American studies thinkers like Walter Mignolo, Aníbal Quijano, Maria Lugones, and others who advocate for understanding colonialism as in part an epistemological structure. Against this idea are settler colonial studies scholars like Eve Tuck and Kei-Wen Yang, Mark Rifkin, and others who insist on decoloniality as a material project of returning land and sovereignty. This tension might be best summarized as one that is rooted in epistemological and cultural studies approaches versus one based in land-back sovereignty and material reparations. I had been working on the project that would become decolonial environmentalisms in parallel with Latinx environmentalisms. When one reviewer rightly dinged us for not taking on the tensions between forms of decolonial thinking, I knew that this was the conversation that I needed to center in my book. So in part, decolonial environmentalisms is a response to a conversation that we started in Latinx environmentalisms, but didn't have the time or space to fully develop. Specifically, I decided to center the conversation about coloniality and its role in perpetuating forms of racial exploitation, extractivism, and the idea that some people are more human than others and therefore available for exploitation. Once I decided to center this conversation, the overarching argument of the book fell into place. That argument is that the mainstream environmental movement is implicated in racial capitalism, colonialism, and environmental harm, and that Latinx cultural producers offer a different vision for an equitable and sustainable humanity. The book does not hold up Latinx literature and culture as a pure and progressive alternative to bad environmentalisms. Instead, it offers moments of self-reflection on our own implication in the destructive forces of settler colonialism as a way of clearing space for the possibility of better futures. Particularly through its comparative and intersectional approach, the book seeks to uncover how forms of novel environmental thinking operate within tensions between settler colonialism and indigeneity, urban and rural, and material and epistemological modes of reform. So I think that's all I want to say now, and I really appreciate everybody taking time. There are many things you can do on your lunch hour or your early breakfast hour, and I so appreciate you spending the time with us today. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, we'll hear from Teresa Dzieglewicz, a Pushcart Prize-winning poet, educator, and activist. She's the author of a poetry book, and her first children's book is forthcoming in 2027. Welcome, Teresa.
Hello, it is so wonderful to be here with you all today, and thank you so much to everybody sharing and to all the organizers and with everything happening in the world right now, with everything happening on this land. I think it's so important to be having these conversations and as David just said, to be clearing space for better futures, right? And so I'm so thankful to be here with you all today thinking about this. So I'm sharing from my book, Something Small of How to See a River. I always want to give a shout out with my cover. The artist is an amazing artist named Val Eagleshield. She sewed this, so I just really love it. My book is about the water protector movement at Standing Rock in 2016, 2017. My friend Elena Eagleshield invited me to help her co-run a school at the camp there. And that's what these poems look at. I want to always acknowledge that I am a white woman. I am a settler on this land. And I want to open with sharing today by bringing in the voice of one of my remarkable students. Her name is Frankie Archambault, and I think she speaks in this quote to the themes of this panel really well. I have throughout the book quotes from the kids. No matter how scary things got, every morning we would pray by the river. Someone would light the sage, and I'd think about all the things I'm thankful for, like how we're by the river and we have clean water and we had breakfast and the sun is coming up. I'd start praying for the water and the people who were sick or troubled at the time. We'd always put our hands in the water. It was so cool, and I could feel it between my fingers as it was flowing down the stream. I'd feel more with myself, more like myself. And then I'm going to share one poem. This is called "On Building a School." Shaylina, age 9, of hot pink coat and perfect scrambled eggs, presses her Velcroed boot against the wire of ice and barbs, opens the fence that keeps us from the river. She tells me what she heard about the sacred objects returned by the county after the raid. Hand-fringed hide of the chanupa bags, deer-given skin of the drums, stained yellow with the piss of police. I crawl through the passage, past the cottonwood choking with leafless vine, the abandoned nest of the snow bunting preserved in its sheath of ice. She speaks of these handmade objects, and I think of what we are trying to build, this idea we call a school. I think of a friend who said, "Native tradition creates beauty in every object, a reminder to care for what you have." I've spent years with the disposable test booklets, the tiny eyes of each multiple choice, classrooms with 4 reliable walls. Years believing I could know what was best. Shaylina, of 6 sisters, of telling adults to stop screaming about cops and scaring the kids, leads me down a sandy slope, away from the road that spins with pickup trucks packed with lumber, ladders, tent poles, these fragments that will rebuild the homes that were taken last week, rebuild homes we all know may be taken again. We dip to a slim cuticle of a bank, frozen, freckled today with trash. Months ago, the kids built a ramshackle bridge here, the driftwood glittering jade with algae, the splintering damp in the sun. They climbed to the edge, unbothered that the bridge reached no certain bank, scrambled on scraped hands and knees, and trusted the rotting of the wood, or maybe trusted even the fall. The first time somebody mentioned staying the winter, among the horse games and giveaways of August, I laughed. The story of my skin made me believe we'd win history quickly. Go home. How will I know how to name this for the kids, for myself, if we fail? Shaylina digs in the cold sand, unearths a Skittles wrapper, the rainbow mud fossiled into brittle bird. I am about to warn her to stay away from the water's cold edge when she slips the trash gently into my hand, says, "Sha." Next, hands me a crinkled Lay's bag, "Ji," a ramen wrapper, "Shaji." She hands me each Lakota color, picks up each piece one by one, as if we'd never heard the ambulances screech from the road, as if the helicopters didn't scar the air with their mosquito song. She names each item as if there was no other sound in the world. for what we held in our hands. Thank you.
So next, we're going to hear from Julianne Warren, whose pronouns are she, her. Julianne is an unsettling settler who is a writer, educator, and activist with a PhD in wildlife ecology and an MFA in creative writing. Welcome, Julianne.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers and for the privilege of being here, and David and Teresa. Teresa, when I was reading your work, I had opened a map so I could see the watershed, and I imagined drinking that glass of water in your kitchen. And thank you, that's beautiful. And I'm here on Lower Tanana Dene lands, Fairbanks, Alaska, where the sun is just coming up. In February 2019, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management held public hearings on their oil and gas leasing plans for the Arctic Refuge Coastal Plain for Gwich'in, Ishikwatan, Gwandai, Gudlit, the sacred place where life begins, calving grounds of Vadzai, the porcupine caribou herd. As I cite in my new book, I often heard Bernadette Dementafez, director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee, say, "We Gwich'in believe we each have a piece of caribou in our heart, and the caribou have a piece of us in their heart. There was a vow that we would always take care of each other." Hearing the many penetrating public comments in a series of Alaska Native persons defending these sacred lands points to why I wrote this book. And one such illuminating comment on record was by Carolyn Tritt-Frank of Vashreko Arctic Village. She's a language educator whose first language is Dinjijukia or Gwich'in. She said, "I think if oil and gas extractors interfere with the caribou, that will destroy the children's language, their way of talking, because everything they use on the caribou is used in Gwich'in, and so every single piece of the caribou has a Gwich'in name." She explained, "This is what's passed on by elders who, quote, usually speak about hunting. So," she said, "I think the language is a major concern for me and the caribou that the elders live on." As I listened closely to Tritt-Frank and the vast majority of Alaska Native testimonies at the hearing, I heard they would never give up defending something that did not translate as subsistence, natural resources, nor defenses of Leopoldian wilderness. Aldo Leopold is best known as the author of the 1949 bestseller A Sand County Almanac. His canonized ideas influenced key strategists envisioning the Arctic refuge and retained sway. In a previous book, I detailed the development of his ethical ecological concept, land health, exemplified by his wilderness area ideas and other well-meaning narratives, which, however, embed settler colonialist racist perspectives oppressing those racialized as non-white, particularly indigenous peoples. And as I delved more into those troubles, I had to talk about how I too, in my cultural ancestors' footsteps, continued to uncritically manifest those harmful things. And I've wanted to do this in a good way, to use a phrase Dementa shared often. For me, I wanted to that meant looking back at my cultural ancestor and my own past self with regard and care while doing this surfacing of troubles. So keeping that in mind, my book's title points to Leopold referring to Alaska as a blank space. He said, "Albeit the most valuable part for those not lacking in imagination. But now I begin understanding how a settler colonizer imagination is devoid of at least 20 indigenous languages belonging in so-called Alaska, and of already mapped Arctic geographies, including caribou bodies, of experiences of Nitsai Gwich'in elder Gilbert Trimble describing Ishikwatan, Gwandai, Gudlit as the, quote, land that holds the bones of thousands of generations of my ancestors." Back in 2019, and again now, I've been working with the Fairbanks Climate Action Coalition, and that has brought me into amazing opportunities for advocacy and decolonial trainings with the Gwich'in Steering Committee, Native Movement, Sovereign Inupiat for a Living Arctic. I have some of those websites up there. With not knowing as part of a deepening practice in learning how to better listen and opening my imagination to populating with Gwich'in, Inupiat, and many more indigenous perspectives, I started prioritizing learning beyond Leopold and the dominating canon I had been educated in and hope to encourage others likewise. So my ongoing journey has brought me into both painful and positive realizations. I also particularly center ideas of Kyle Powys Way, a philosopher and Potawatomi citizen, as I expand on Leopoldian narratives and how they have blanked out and continue blanking out indigenous histories, justice and ethics, and consent with respect for indigenous sovereignty. So, in other words, being rooted in the same culture as extractive mining and being two sides of the same coin that affect land theft, that prop up power structures and override indigenous self-determination. Of course, it remains crucial to surface differences between rapacious land demolition and land protection, and I continue to work ardently for the latter. But I think it's been less recognized and important to see the need to listen for crucial differences between settler colonialist conservation ideas such as Leopoldian ones and many indigenous worldviews. Just to my understanding positively, this is requisite to reparative and equitably respectful relations, the possibility of that, and stabilizing coalitions for life. So for the love of land and story on my part, my book supports repopulating, restructuring, releasing decolonized imaginations for enacting, in words of Waziyatowin, Angela Wilson, and Michael Yellowbird. And on this slide, the conscious, intelligent, calculated, and active unlearning and resistance to the forces of colonization that perpetuate the subjugation and exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. And it is engaged for the ultimate purpose of overturning the colonial structure and realizing indigenous liberation. And again, as I understand, that liberation is bound to each other's. And so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Finally, we'll hear from Allison Carruth, Professor of American Studies and Environmental Studies at Princeton University and founding director of Blue Lab.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Amy McIntyre and the ASLE staff for making the Spotlight series possible. And I also wanted to thank Lisa and Sarah for co-hosting. And it's just an honor to be in conversation with David, Teresa, and Julianne. And if you joined late, I just want to encourage you to go to the top of the chat. I just echo Lisa and Sarah's call to be supporting and in solidarity with the Day of Action in Minnesota and much beyond today. So what I'm going to do with my 5 minutes is read a very condensed and short excerpt from the final chapter of novel Ecologies, Nature, Remade, and the Illusions of Tech, that I thought would speak to our framework for today and to the other three beautiful projects. So without further ado, I'll do that. Life after Earth. It was on a trip between the headlands of Mendocino County and the strand of Morro Bay, the latter known for its twin landmarks of an offshore volcanic rock and a decommissioned power plant, that I began to think about fantasies of space colonization as the subject for the final chapter of novel Ecologies. The world looks wild along much of this 400-mile California route. The midnight blue of the deep ocean collides with the surface disturbance of whitecaps, kelp beds, and rock outcroppings. Birds of prey dot the sky, traveling over redwood groves and chaparral hillsides in parallel to the Pacific Coast Highway, aka Highway 1. My experience of these landscapes is hardly novel, especially since the completion of the highway in the 1960s. This stretch of the Pacific coastline has become a storied place, thick with ideas of the blue planet as a wondrous and potentially singular world in its support of all kinds of life. For decades, however, both storytellers and engineers have written over this picture postcard view of California by crafting a narrative of the state and the American West more broadly as a living lab for pioneering technology, big infrastructure, and terraforming. The last of these borrows directly from the pages of California's sci-fi that since at least the 1950s has puzzled out how to remake planets, asteroids, and moons so that at least some humans could live on them. This corpus now influences the ambitions of both established institutions like NASA and deep-pocketed corporate ventures to realize what SpaceX CEO Elon Musk proclaimed at a 2016 meeting of the International Aeronautical Congress will be a multi-planetary future. Musk's forecast is at once eco-apocalyptic and techno-utopian, or what I would today call techno-fascistic. It anticipates an abstract doomsday event that would make Earth all but unlivable, while taking as a foregone conclusion the space-faring aims of his company. From waterworks to space colonies, California's history of and stake in world-making seeks to actualize the concept spaceship Earth. The term comes from the eccentric theory that the architect and inventor Buckminster Fuller hashed out during the first space race, a theory that conceived of the planet as a complex machine requiring engineers to ensure its operation and update its systems on a regular basis. Notably, Fuller relocated to California in 1980 and lived out his brief remaining life in the Pacific Palisades. He died there in 1983, just 2 weeks after JPL's Pioneer 10 became the first spacecraft to travel past Jupiter and reach the outer solar system. In this century, the desire of California engineers to make worlds has turned increasingly to the stars. Known for sci-fi novels about terraforming, Kim Stanley Robinson observes that California has been a major source of inspiration for such desires. In an interview, the novelist muses that the state is itself a science fictional place. Quote, the desert has been terraformed. The whole water system is unnatural and artificial. It's big, it's various. It's an entire country. It's an entire planet, end quote. The photographer Baron Bixler concurs. When I began photographing the state's sprawling network of mines, pits, quarries, and materials processing plants in the early days of the new millennium, I was drawn to the landscapes by their terraformed brutalism, which seemed at odds with the California imaginary, end quote. That California itself has been deconstructed and remade many times over, such that certain landscapes can pass for denuded Martian ones, haunts the fantasy of what I call Musk and Co., and reminds us that world building and world destroying often go hand in hand. Through this lens, the new space race is extending to Mars and beyond, terrestrial narratives of the American frontier, its white settlers, and its engineers. What follows puts the Silicon Valley architects of 21st century rockets and Martian settlements into conversation with artists, scientists, and writers who illuminate the perils of space races old and new, and imagine the universe is too big, alive, and manifold to be an inert terrain for world making. The writers who are central to this critique of a multiplanetary future for a human elite, namely the novelists T.C. Boyle and Octavia Butler and the poet Tracy K. Smith, perceive the engineer's quest to settle other worlds as hubristic, absurd, and violent. Their work shows a paradox at the heart of contemporary space colony ventures. The belief that Earth is already a lost cause, hurtling towards doomsday, entwined with the promise that these ventures are rescue missions that will secure life after Earth for at least a chosen few. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Just what a pleasure and honor to hear each of the four of you speak about your really beautiful and brilliant and powerful books. We're going to move on next to some co-moderator questions before sharing questions from the chat, which is a good encouragement for folks to put their questions in the chat. And the questions that Lisa and I are going to pose are for all of our panelists. Before we get into our questions, we want to openly acknowledge the lack of Indigenous representation in this episode and call it out as an issue, particularly given the theme. We imagine the authors are also holding this tension, as we know that various manifestations of the decolonial, the anti-colonial, decolonization, and settler colonial critique emerge across all of your new works. It's an irony that is indicative with the problems within our fields and really the academy as a whole. We are discussing many works that are brilliantly and incisively calling on us to decenter settler voices and listen to Indigenous perspectives in a lineup that does not include Indigenous scholars and creatives. And we really just want to name and hold that tension as we move forward.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to start us off with the first question, which relates to those comments and actually something that David mentioned earlier. So given this theme for this specific spotlight episode, Decolonizing Environments, how would each of you position your work in relation to the concepts and genealogies of this set of terms, decolonial, decolonization, anti-colonial, and or settler colonial critique? If you distinguish between these concepts, why do you use the ones you do when you do? How do you decide which concepts to use when?
And maybe you could ask a bigger question for question 2, Lisa. I guess, the way that I would answer that question is to invoke the definition that Julianne actually projected in the background of her image, which is about a kind of material project of reform, right? Like an active working towards the dismantling of the kinds of dispossession and exploitation that we have seen over time. But I also want to mention that the way that I have been thinking about the decolonial has been inflected not just by the kind of epistemological turn in Latin American thinking and the settler colonial material projects that we see in more contemporary settler colonial studies scholarship, but also there's an older tradition within Chicano Latino studies that thinks about the decolonial as well, that I'm sort of trying to kind of hold and keep present, which thinks about Latinx people as also sort of internally colonized people. I'm not advocating for this framework, but I'm thinking about it as another way of thinking about projects of anti-racism and decolonial thinking. So I don't have a strong answer for how I want to how for the question that you asked, Lisa. But what I would say is that I think what we're trying to name when we use these various terminologies is to think about the structures, the kind of ongoing structures of racial capitalism that produce logics of extraction, logics of dehumanization, logics of racial classification, etc. Right. And so there are attempts to kind of grapple with and name the project of European, Eurocentric, Euro-American, Western expansionist civilization that I think Allison actually brought up a really important term, which was ecofascism as well, which we're seeing manifesting in those logics now as well. So I'll shut up there because there's lots of smart people on this call.
I can share. So I mean, I want to, with apologies, I'm working outside of the academy, and so I'm coming from maybe a slightly less academic, a viewpoint on some of these things, and it's so beautiful to hear you all speaking and to learn from your thoughts. I mean, I think that, at the camp, the school at the camp, we were very lucky to be working within this incredibly, indigenous, specifically Lakota space, that folks worked so hard to create. And when we would talk about, I mean, the school, or really, place of learning, first we would say decolonizing education, and then we were like, no, actually, this isn't about decolonizing education. Like Elena Eagleshield, who started the school, she would say, like, actually, we're just making Lakota education. We're not trying to decolonize an institution someone else has made. We're just thinking about what is the learning for this space, right? And so that is the way I really try to think about it, and as a white relative supporting Indigenous sovereignty, I want to be able to think about not about colonialism so much, but about what is it we actually want to build and create together, right? What are the wild and generous and loving ways that we can care for each other, that we can care for the earth, that we can be in relationship outside of the systems that colonialism has created?
I love that. This is all really fascinating. And I come in and out of the academy myself. And in fact, I learned about decolonization from grassroots experience. So it was in the mixture of relationships being key, and also anti-colonialism was a term I came to later, which I think is handy. Maybe it's a way to talk about, in fact, what I'm doing in my book, in a sense, like and it's also a way to talk about settler colonial critique, like, which I think can be on a spectrum of being more deeply critical of, or like transformative of ontology, or less so, leaving, like, for example, like some critique might leave Leopold centered and some might not. So there's like a spectrum there. But I think that that kind of work, even like what I'm doing in deeply critiquing Leopold and trying to decenter him, has maybe an intellectual and maybe an emotional component, but that might just like fizzle out if it doesn't come into relationship with other people. And I think that decolonial work seems to me to be embodied and enacted in relationship and in generating relationships. That's just something that this made me start thinking about. And I think I put in the word unsettling too, as a way, like reading Albert Memmi, like acknowledging that as a white settler who doesn't want to be involved in colonization but is no matter what because of racialization and everything, that there's this sort of tension, that I'm a settler but I'm unsettling, and the unsettling is sort of similar to what decolonization is, but it like kind of adds that tension, I think, that is present.
Yeah, this is, thank you, Lisa, for this question. It's a hard question. I was curious when you shared that this would be the first question, how often I use the term decolonial in novel ecologies, and it's only once, that term. It's where I'm actually quoting the brilliant environmental humanities scholar Heidi Emin Hong's analysis of Craig Santos Perez, a really important figure and poet and thinker for me in novel ecologies. Conversely, I use the terms, colonialism, colonial and settler colonialism, and neo-colonial throughout the book. And I think all I would offer here is that novel ecologies is sort of first and foremost an effort to really, one, unsettle my own, the allure that techno-utopianism had for me for a very long time. And as I share in the prologue to the book, where I too was sort of in the thrall of some of these imaginaries. And so it's really trying to kind of excavate the deeply colonial foundation within sort of 21st century tech environmentalisms, or what passes sort of environmentalisms, and to bring a sort of cacophony of different stories and literary and artistic voices sort of into confrontation with that. And to go to what David said a moment ago, like if I were to write the book today, I would probably be engaging deeply with both some of the critiques of techno-fascism, but also specifically eco-fascism. And so I think that maybe would be a kind of, I don't know how many terms we have, fifth term that I would bring into contact with these other concepts. I hope that's useful.
Thank you all for these really nuanced and beautiful answers. I'm going to ask my question, and then we'll move to the questions of the chat. So I encourage people to continue sharing them. I've seen a couple of great questions pop up. And I'm sorry, David, I don't think my question is any smaller than Lisa's, but hopefully it will be as generative. I'm really interested in the ways that you each envision the audience for your works and how that shapes your methodology and your style of writing. What role do the decolonial, decolonization, the anti-colonial and/or settler colonial critique play in shaping the method you used, your approach, your style of writing, and/or the vision of audience you had for your works?
I'll hop in. last time. I love this question. I mean, audience, it's like sort of what one envisions for the audience, what an actual audience is, right? Sometimes there are big gaps between that. I mean, for me at this like stage in my sort of working life, I feel like this field, or sort of constellation fields that we call the environmental humanities, is at such a just exciting, moment in its sort of evolution. And I mean, I'm just inspired by the work that is happening across the field internationally, including in areas that are way outside my expertise and focus. And so I think one of the things in writing novel ecologies over what was like an 8-year period, researching and writing over an 8-year period, was how much it was shaped by seeing like the sort of, all of these new and emergent areas that are on display today. Also, like, I think really hoping that scholarship in the field can also be praxis, right? Can also like be a creative practice, can be a political practice or social practice. And I know our time is short. There's so many people who've been models for me around that. So I think I wrote the book with some of that kind of driving me. And for that reason, there are these sort of personal interludes, and you heard a very brief one. But I opened the book with my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, and the town of St. Clair, Wyoming, where he worked as a machinist in an oil refinery for his whole working life. And I think, I'm sure others will. I mean, it's so wonderful to be here, with the three other folks, where I think we're all coming from different traditions and fields, but there's something there's kinship in our methods. So I'll leave it at that.
When I wrote this book, it was in response to um responsibility that came out of both joy and pain. I think recognizing as I interacted with people here on the front lines that Leopold was not only irrelevant but offensive, and that I did have kind of a shame response at first. I was like even earlier than that, I was a little bit defensive, and then working through that to realize this was a responsibility to grasp hold of, and mm, a privilege to be able to work on and work through. And there's one paragraph in my book that I think, and so it's written for other white people, that as audience, and I say that I hope that will help the settler wildlife scientist and educator of the settler agrarian who looked to Leopold as a founder. I hope they can take courage to question the validity of research based in erasures of indigenous people and to privilege indigenous scientific expertise. I hope it can help the settler philosopher to rethink settler ethics within indigenous-led collaborations and support the liberation of the indigenous philosopher from settler presumptions of Leopold's relevance. I hope the English literary scholar can help them develop their own anti-colonialist praxis, the Chinese language reader and poet admiring a Sand County Almanac, which it's been translated into 14 languages, to reconsider the imposition of this and other U.S. settler narratives, and the Oke Owenge Pueblo matriarch and author to being among the last whose teachers insensitively assign Leopold's book as a model with no alternatives. Those interactions really touched me, and I wanted to write to help remedy some of those problems.
Allison and Julian, it was so beautiful to hear your responses to this. And like Allison said, I do think there is a deep kinship in the way that we're all thinking about this, right? And I think that it's that word, that word of kinship that I think has a lot to do with how I'm trying to think about my methodologies, as I think is true for all four of us. And I want to um, kinship, being a relative, is, I think, a very deep and important part of, Lakota culture and many all indigenous cultures. And I want to shout out my friend Kimimila Locke, who has done a lot of work, I think, to help me understand that and to think about what it means to be a relative. I think that was a really driving force in thinking about how to write this book. I think both in thinking about, I wanted it to be a book in deep relation. And so there are a lot of different voices. There are a lot of different quotes. As I said, each section starts with the voice of one of the students. I wanted it to be a really multivocal work, that feels woven, that feels collaborative and created together. I think also I wanted to be able to think about the audience as being, any reader as being a relative and being there with me, and I wanted it to hopefully, be generous in that way, to feel like we're, maybe we're holding hands and you're coming to the camp here, to really be a part of the movement in that way. I was so graciously and generously welcomed, and I wanted the book to be generous with the reader in that way as well. And to assume that they are here to be in relationship. And I think that for me, there's also a level of accessibility around that too. Like I wanted it to be a work that, that a lot of different people would be able to pick up and be able to engage with. And so I think that relationship is a driving force of how I wrote this.
I mean, what a great question, and what great answers you all have given. My first response is always to be a little bit snarky and say, well, I wrote it for my mom, so my mom could read it. But the truth is, my mom's not going to read my book, right? And it's not really written for a general audience. Like I was seeking to make a specific intervention, particularly in the field of Latinx studies, but also in relation to kind of critical race and ethnic studies more generally. And with that in mind, like I mean, I would love to write a book that would get adapted on Netflix or something like that, but like I don't have that skill set. So when I was approaching this book, there are certain moments in a writing process where it is actually very helpful to imagine a specific reader, because then you can kind of have a mental conversation with that person. So at various moments as I was writing, I actually thought of Sarah. And I was like, what would Sarah need to know to like get what I'm trying to say here, And it's kind of helpful to have to play out that mental conversation. I have a former colleague at UC Berkeley, Sherry Hundorf, who I often think of when I'm writing things as like a smart person who wants to read with me and maybe doesn't know the specifics of what I'm talking about, but is willing to think along. And so, like, what does a reader like that need? But I think at the end of the day, this was always meant to be a critical race and ethnic studies book that, while I strive for clarity, like undergraduate readers, I hope would be able to pick this book up and kind of understand what I have to say. Um, but it's an academic book, and I just want to be like transparent and honest about that with myself, but also, with any prospective readers and audience, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge like where we're coming from. And that's why I think, like the critical race and ethnic studies piece was always really front and center for me, because that's the thing that I care about the most. It's where my expertise is. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful answers to our questions. We're going to move now to some questions that audience or participants have put in the chat. And I want to invite Ananya Roy Pratar, apologies if I've mispronounced your name. If you'd like to come off mute and share your question with the panelists, you're welcome to.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for allowing me to converse with the panel. It was so beautiful to listen to all of you. And I'm speaking from India. And my question is that because we have been reading Donna Haraway and we have been working in indigenous knowledge system, my question is that when we talk from this South Asian perspective and do this concept of responsibility, like when I was listening to one of you said that we care for each other and we can come up with we can jump in together to find a solution. So will this concept of responsibility that Donna Haraway has already explained in her book might help us think more productively about decolonial environmentalism in this regard without subsuming this situated knowledge into universal ethical frameworks? Is it possible? That's my question. Thank you.
I'll just offer a brief response. Thank you for the question. I increasingly I'm sort of going to really like everyday concepts that are tied to, that both have scholarly traditions and intellectual traditions, but also like an everyday practice or sort of veracity meaning. And so alongside like responsibility in the way that you're thinking through Haraway, like I think too, like kindness is something that I think I hear present in all of these projects in different ways, and the in my case, the storytellers in particular that I sort of bring into to confront these tech futurisms, there's this shared kind of generosity or kindness that is that's rooted in multi-species and environmental justice and also radical political traditions. But it is also just that, like a capacity for and a cultivating of kindness. I think that might be something else. And again, I think without that becoming something universal or emptied out of, histories of violence and ongoing violence and inequality, I think there's something really powerful about that for me. In response to your question, that's what emerged.
Right. Thank you. That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question. I will also speak briefly. So if I'm hearing your question right, I think you're thinking about responsibility as a framework for a kind of ethical commitment to other human beings in more communion than in terms of individualism, right?
You're right.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a really useful framework, right? So in the first chapter in my book, I have a critique of eco-cosmopolitanism, and part of what I'm arguing there is that not that not that eco-cosmopolitanism is the problem, but cosmopolitanism kind of is, right? And its root
Exactly.
in Kantian ethics, like, is deeply problematic, right? And so I think too often we have treated, the idea of individuality and the kind of hyper individualism that we have in the West writ large as a kind of
Yes.
transparent process that, just sort of happened. But it's actually an engineered concept, right? And one that we buy into. And so I think that, whether we're thinking through Haraway or thinking through, some of the artists that I consider in my book, or thinking through other folks who have thought more about the communal, that these are very rich possibilities, right? Because if we think about the logic of individualism, it's rooted in a very specific notion of humanity. And if you don't fit that, then you're available for exploitation, right? In terms of labor exploitation, racial exploitation, extractivism, it's part and parcel of the logic of extractivism. So I think, yeah, that is a kind of rich possibility. I don't know how we do the work. I don't have an answer to that question, but I do think that it's a line of flight or a trajectory or a possibility that could be worth it for us to kind of explore.
Right. Thank you so much.
It just makes me think about the deep ontological revisioning that Kim Tallbear talks about. And like I've heard a colleague here talk about, bringing um, a shift in ways of being as a settler that becomes so integrated, like in my DNA or in, my friends, other settlers' DNA, that we can then be in better and better relationship with one another. I don't know if that gets to what the question is, but it's what it turned my thought to think about. Yeah.
Well, and to agree and build on to what you're saying, Julianne, too, I think that relationships are a kind of responsibility, right? Like there is a level of like commitment and obligation when you're in a relationship, and there's also context, right? Like, and I think that that's really important. Like, like my relationship with my child as a mother is different than my relationship with my friend, and they have different commitments and responsibilities in different contexts. And I think about that, like, when we really, really work to understand the land we're on, and we really work to understand each other, and we really work to understand the stories, then we learn the context that our relationships are functioning in, and we think about our own roles and responsibilities. And so I think it is always specific. I think that when we are trying to be deeply committed and in relationship with each other, like it brings that specificity naturally.
Yeah, going off of that, it makes me think about the way it was like two other scholars, Bonnie Shee and Anna Cook, were talking about like the lamination, the groundless normativity of like what Leopoldian thinking did, and I suppose any concept could take that over. And then what Reverend Gilbert Trimble and Gwitchin Elder here talked about, wilderness as like as a ideology that overlaid, their traditional time immemorial place. And so peeling that away just gave me that image of peeling that away and being where we are, where I don't know, it sounds to me like none of us could be doing the work we're doing if it comes from the places where we are. That seems, yeah, like what's happening with all of us too.
Thank you so much for addressing this question. Thank you for your views. It's really wonderful because I'm working from South Asian perspective, and my understanding of indigenous or the tribal culture that I'm working with is, it's very difficult, to put them on the global discussion. So it's a challenge on our part, and it's a I think uh, to come to the centralist position, or come to join the global voice is, as Amitav Ghosh says, it's uncanny sometimes. So thank you for this panel. I really have I do have a lot of takeaways from your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we are out of time, so I apologize that we couldn't get to the other question in the chat, but I think this has been a really rich conversation, and I hope everyone is checking out the conversations that have continued in the chat. I really want to thank Lisa for co-hosting with me. I want to thank Amy and Aubrey for the work they did setting this up, and I really want to thank each of our speakers for their contributions, and remind everyone once again to Stand with Minnesota, check out those links we dropped in the chat, and check out the books that are also linked in the chat.